Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm continuing my series about the Irish oppression myth, so trying to disabuse some people of their misapprehensions. And so many of us have drunk this in with our mother's milk. We often hear that we were occupied by England, later Great Britain. Nationalists tend to conflate the two and often say, oh, they sympathise with the cause of Scots separatism. Now, that's the curious thing about nationalists. They think that one island must be united and the other must be divided. Or Irish nationalism is also this. They believe that two rather similar countries, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, should be united. Similar countries should be united, unless those countries happen to be Scotland, Wales and England. Or indeed the Republic of Ireland with all the others. So what is it? What's the common thread? Is it just being anti-England? Seems it to me. So, I mean, I know most nationalists are not anti-English on a personal level, may well have English friends and all the rest of it, marry English people, but there's this idea that being separated from England is necessarily a good thing. And it reminds me how Europhilia from Irish nationalism, Irish nationalists, is illogical and hypocritical. I could refer you back to what Patrick Pearse wrote. I think it was his essay Ghosts, shortly before the Easter Rising, saying, you know, he listed all these rebel leaders and say that, I don't know, you might want home rule or something. I may be preaching a safer gospel, but it is not the same gospel. And quite right, it's not nationalism. Now, admittedly, mainstream nationalism through the 19th century into the early 20th century was about us having a devolved status within the United Kingdom, or else being a sister kingdom, resurrecting Grattan's Parliament, with one crucial difference, obviously, that the Catholic majority would be in the driving seat, and we'd all have the right to vote and be MPs and so on. Right, so, you know, showing that we're not occupied is that our leaders, and they were largely hereditary in the 12th century, had agreed to us being connected to Great Britain. Now, was there some force involved in getting them to agree to that? Indeed there was, which is the way it worked at that time. All international treaties would have to be invalidated if that were the case. And as I pointed out, Irish kingdoms and the idea of having a High King of Ireland, that was also brought about by force, but nobody claims that that was illegitimate now. There we are. So in Ireland we were quite often enlisting the help of Danes against other Irish people, or other Gaels. I'll come back to that, about how the notion of being a Gael and being Irish are often conflated. So I talked a bit about the honourable record of the British Army in Ireland. No, wasn't completely without stain, but overall decent. You know, people didn't have in the troubles and so on, they mostly knew they had nothing to fear from the Crown forces, and that's why people sometimes verbally abused soldiers in the street, knowing that nothing would happen to them. Right, so that's why joining the British Army was commonplace for people who were nationalists. I don't mean Catholics just, I mean people who were nationalists and political outlook. Of course, many people are apolitical and barely have a national identity, just don't really think about these things, need a job, join. But some of them really were nationalists. They wanted Ireland to be autonomous or even totally separate. That comes on to being a republican, I suppose, but still joined the Crown forces, didn't necessarily see a contradiction. It was no disadvantage in nationalist politics to have been in the British Army or the Royal Navy. Indeed, Catherine O'Shea, commonly called Kitty O'Shea, her husband used his British Army rank in civilian life. Or senior figures in the Home Rule Party like Tom Kettle volunteered for the British Army in the Great War. Or William Archer Redmond, he campaigned for Parliament in 1918 in Waterford wearing his Irish Guards uniform, the Irish Guards being a unit of the British Army. So yes, there were regiments from Wales, Scotland and England and Ireland, as there were Irish regiments in Great Britain. We made the most tremendous contribution to British imperialism. We're more imperialist than the Welsh, Scots and English. If you look at our rate of recruiting, 1/3 of the British Army in the mid-19th century was Irish. Yeah, out of all proportion to our numbers within the UK at the time, the UK including Ireland back then. So you look at all the people we sent out to govern the British Empire at all levels, from squaddies up to governors general. Earl of Mayo, who was Governor General of India, Viceroy of India, John Burke, he was called, he was assassinated. Or we had a governor of Hong Kong in the mid-19th century. A lot of people say, oh, that was Protestants though. As though Protestants are not Irish, it reveals the sectarian character of many nationalists, that they'll try and invalidate somebody's Irishness by saying that the person is Protestant, or indeed saying they're upper class. So we have to be only working class people are Irish. This is absurd, and it's class bigotry too. There are many more examples of this. So we were involved in all the honourable aspects of British imperialism, bringing education to other parts of the world, and technology, medicine, saving countless lives, famine relief. But we're also involved in some revolting chapters of imperialism. For instance, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in India in April 1919. Brigadier General Edward Harry Dyer, should have been called Killer, the man who killed well over 400 Indian civilians. This mass murderer was Irish, I regret to say, though he's been born in India. And the governor of the Punjab at the time, Sir Michael O'Dwyer, was from Tipperary. He was later bumped off by Udham Singh in 1940 over in London. Or Sir Kenneth O'Connor was a judge in Kenya in the 1950s, and he sentenced a lot of people to be hanged. Now, by the law of the time, often this was illegal, but their trials seemed to be rather rushed. Not entirely sure they all had due process. I could go on. So, in the 1970s, it was no longer common for nationalists to join, partly because the IRA, in their valiant manner, had taken to killing soldiers who were home on leave. They almost always went for people who were unarmed. So these people who were joining until the 70s, they could have joined the Irish Defence Forces from the 20s to the 70s, but no, many of them were still joining the Crown Forces. These people opted to serve under the Union flag. They were swearing an oath of allegiance to the British monarch. Bear in mind, the last King of Ireland was George VI. Yes, he inherited that title in 1936, and de Valera's government did not dispute that he was the King of Ireland. And finally, in 1949, south of Ireland, we declared a republic, and the Government of Ireland Act came in, and His Britannic Majesty stopped using that title. So for centuries, hundreds of thousands of Irish people have joined the British Army, so it is preposterous to suggest that it is a foreign army. When the Irish Guards were guarding Buckingham Palace, does that mean that England was under Irish military occupation? This would be in the highest degree absurd to contend that. And we were hugely overrepresented in the British Parliament. We were overrepresented 3 times in relation to our population. How can we possibly have such an overrepresentation per capita if we were in any sense oppressed? And we produced cabinet ministers, not least E.H. Carson. So very plugged into into mainstream British politics. And I pointed out how way back in the Wars of the Roses, 2 claimants, 2 Yorkist claimants, Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, both imposters as it turns out, were crowned in Ireland, one in Dublin, one in Cork. Don't remember which one's which. But it shows how England was connected to us just so much. And nobody said, oh, they don't belong here because they're English, or the King of England's got nothing to do with Ireland. Fully accepted. So all these dynastic wars from England spilled over into Ireland. Not an entirely good thing. Incidentally, looking way back to not Edward the Confessor, Harold Godwinson, his sons fled to Ireland. So we're often descended from the ancient Britons who in the 4th century AD, or 5th century AD more like it, had fled from the Anglo-Saxons. So the British Army was not alien to Ireland. Many of us have won awards for gallantry and risen to the very highest ranks. And the Crown Forces were probably the institution that did best in eliminating sectarianism. So there'd be members of Orange Lodges in the same regiment as people who were in various Catholic organisations. And so the Royal Irish Constabulary, the Royal Navy likewise, were organisations where people of all denominations met on an equal footing and served with very little animus. So I am not deluding myself. I recognise the situation was not perfect. We've got to be a little bit realistic. And I don't deny that there was some hibernophobia in Great Britain. So say before the Troubles, it was quite low level, people saying disobliging things occasionally, cracking jokes. But, you know, if we're self-assured and we're not too touchy, we can laugh at ourselves. Unfortunately, there's some people who are so dim who don't realise what a joke is, and they think that when people crack jokes about us being thick, that we really were less intelligent than them, which reflects on those who would believe that rather than on us. But obviously, when the Troubles broke out, there was a spike in hibernophobia, and people rightly thought that we might be about to bomb them. And of course, Irishmen were setting off bombs everywhere. So not surprisingly, Paddy was looked at with suspicion, and people would always be looked askance at a community from which terrorism emanating, and obviously most of us weren't responsible for that. It's an unfair reaction, but it is unfortunately an inevitable reaction. As I pointed out, loyalist terrorists were despicable and are to be deprecated, and the Crown forces were not entirely blameless either. That's enough at the moment.